Okay, so DPI. What is DPI? DPI is dots per inch. And it's really a leftover from the old printer days. You know, it describes the resolution or the dots per inch of an image that you're sending to a printer. And it also describes the maximum resolution of a printer. So a printer may have a capability of 600 DPI or 1200 DPI. So that tells you the maximum printed resolution of that printer. There's also another term, it's called PPI, which is pixels per inch, which really describes the resolution of a digital image or a digital display. So like most of my images that I'm just going to use for display, that I'm not going to print, I typically set those at 100 pixels per inch resolution, horizontal and vertical resolution. And like I said, it also describes the resolution of a digital display. Like my monitor, I think, is capable of displaying an image at 128 PPI, so 128 pixels per inch resolution, horizontal and vertical. So what is a good DPI to print a photograph so that it looks really good? Okay, so I was under the impression, you know, when I first got a decent camera, it's the camera that I'm using right now. It's a Canon EOS Rebel T2i, and it takes pretty decent photos. I've had it for years. The vast majority of the photos that we've used in these tutorials were taken by that camera. So I was always under the impression that the higher the DPI, the better the print was going to be. So after taking some photos with my brand spanking new camera, I formatted them, cropped them at 8x10 and set the DPI at 600 DPI. So I loaded them up on a flash drive, took them to a professional printer service, handed the guy the flash drive. So he's inspecting the files and he turns to me with one eyebrow cocked like, this guy really doesn't know what he's doing, does he? And he says, you know, the file sizes are really big. And I said, yeah, they're 600 DPI. I was so proud of myself, bringing in images at that high of a DPI. I couldn't do that with my previous camera. And he looks at me and he says, you know, you really don't need anything more than 300 DPI for printing photos. And I'm like, this guy obviously doesn't know what he's talking about, right? So anyway, he goes ahead, he prints the images, he brings them over for my inspection. They look absolutely fantastic. So I take them home. I take more images, and I've got a handful of images I want to take and get printed again. Only this time I thought I'll call his bluff. I'll set these images at 300 DPI. So I take them down there, I give him the flash drive. He brings them up on his computer, he prints them out, doesn't say anything this time. So he brings the images over and shows them to me, and they look absolutely fantastic. I was kind of surprised. I was really expecting it to be lower quality than the previous prints, you know, that where the images were at 600 DPI. So I thought, okay, well, I'll take them home and I'll compare them with the images that I had printed at 600 DPI. And I'm sure that when I compare the two, I'll be able to see the difference in the quality between the two images. So I did that. And I could not tell any difference in the quality between the images that were printed at 300 DPI and the images that were printed at 600 DPI. Now, I'm sure there is a quality improvement on the 600 DPI compared to the 300 DPI. It's just that the human eye does not have the ability to detect that much detail. So to the human eye, 300 DPI print is going to look just as good as a 600 DPI. And you can get larger prints with 300 DPI image than you can with a 600 DPI. As a matter of fact, you can print the images twice as big with 300 DPI as you can with 600 DPI. And we'll talk about DPI and image size and how DPI affects your image size when we're talking about prints. So Rule of thumb, if you've got images that you're going to print, 300 DPI for your prints is an excellent DPI to use for having fantastic looking printed images. Now, if you're going to print them yourself, just make sure that the printer that you're sending them to is capable of printing at 300 DPI. Otherwise, you're going to wonder why the resolution of the image is not what you expected. So, okay, so now let's talk about how DPI affects print size. Okay, so when you have a digital image that you're wanting to print, and like I said, my images I typically set at 100 DPI or pixels per inch. See, I'm using those synonymously. So I usually set my images at 100 pixels per inch, horizontal and vertical resolution. That's pretty good. That's a pretty decent resolution for just displaying the image on a digital display. But if I want to print it at 300 DPI, well, I've only got so many pixels to start with, and although the algorithms in these applications are getting better at trying to fill in missing information if you scale the image larger, they're not perfect. And so if you scale the image larger from what your camera was capable of taking, you are going to lose some clarity in the image because it can't perfectly fill in the missing information. So be aware of that. So I try to never scale my images up that I'm going to print if I want the prints to look as good as they possibly can. So if that's the case and I can't create pixels out of thin air, then how do I get my DPI to 300 when I'm starting with 100? And there's only one way you can do that. You have to make the pixels smaller. So in order to go from 100 DPI to 300 DPI, I have to make the pixels 1/3 the size of the original pixel so that you're fitting more of them within that inch. So instead of being able to display 100 pixels per inch, I'm going to be able to display 300 pixels per inch in the same amount of space. Then the pixels have to be 1/3 their original size, or the dot per inch. I'm not really changing the digital resolution. I'm changing the resolution of the image that's going to be set to the printer. I've got Inkscape up and I created this little graphic here so that I could better explain that. Okay, so here's my original image with all the blue dots. And I've got the ruler up here. And as you can see, it's a very small image and it's very low resolution. Okay, but as you can see there, it is 4 pixels wide and it's 4 pixels high. And as you can see in the resolution here, it only has 2 pixels per inch horizontally, 2 pixels per inch vertically. Let's say I want to double that resolution. When I print this, I want it to print it at 4 DPI rather than 2 DPI. So I'm doubling the resolution of this image before I send it to the printer. So if I take this one, the one that shows the red dots, this is going to be our printed image. This is our display image, and this is going to be our printed image. So if I go up here and I need to make these pixels half the size they originally were. So I'm going to put this at 200 instead of 400. And as you can see, I'll move it up here. Now, as you can see, I've changed the resolution from 2 pixels per inch to 4 pixels per inch. I now have 4 pixels within 1 inch of space horizontally and 4 pixels within 1 inch of space vertically. But what did I have to do that? I had to make the pixels half the size they originally were in order to double the resolution. So if I double the resolution, the DPI printing the image, the printed size is only going to be half the original size of the image. Does that make sense? So if in the original image at 2 pixels per inch, it showed a image size of 8 by 10. When I changed the dots per inch from 2 pixels per inch to 4, the printed image size is going to be half of that. So the 8 by 10 original image, sending it to the printer at double the resolution, it's now going to be, instead of 8 by 10, it's going to be a 4 by 5. And I will try to better display that. Let me bring up GIMP here, and let's open up one of our image files. Okay, so I've got this image here, and I'm going to scale it so it fits the window. And I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to set it for 75% so it fits in the window. And if I right click here and I go to image and I go to scale, and I'll switch this to pixels per inch. See, it's the resolution of the image is 100 pixels on the X resolution horizontally and 100 pixels per inch vertically. And then if I go up here and look at my image size, width, and height, and I change it to inches, well, it's a little over 19 inches by a little over 10 inches, or almost 11 inches. So if I was going to print this image at 100 DPI, it's not going to look very good. But if I was to print this image at 100 DPI, I could print it at 19 inches by almost 11 inches. That's a pretty good size print, but it's not going to look good. So if I go down here and I change my DPI to 300, watch what happens to my image size up here in inches. Now, I've got almost, my width is about 6.5 inches by 3.6 inches, about 6.5 inches by 3.5 inches. At 300 DPI, that is the image size I'm going to be able to print at 300 DPI, where it's going to look good, as opposed to 100 DPI, because you got to make those, in order to get the higher resolution, you've got to make the image smaller, the printed image smaller. But for your printed image, every time that you double the pixels per inch or the DPI on your image, it cuts in half the size of the image as it will be printed. So that's something to remember. Whenever you change the resolution for printing, it directly affects the print size of the image. Okay, and like I said, I have from that time forward, when I was telling you my story about taking the images for printing at the professional printing service, I've always set it now. My image is at 300 DPI for printing, and they've always looked fantastic. Whether I'm taking them to a local printing service, whether I'm using it to print a photo book online, as long as I provide the images at 300 DPI for my print size, they've always looked fantastic. So 300 DPI is a very good rule of thumb to use for printing your image. But remember, it directly affects the size of the prints. Okay, so I hope that explains it. I hope I didn't muddy the water with it. But anyway, if you got any questions, let me know. That is a wrap on this episode. Stay tuned, and I will see you in the next episode.